So I've been meaning to cover the Rescue Ranger for quite some time now, but I never really got around to it because I wasn't sure how I should approach this. The Rescue Ranger is meant to be a tool first and then a weapon second. Of course, tools can be weapons to some extent and vice versa, but that's not really their main purpose to begin with. And for that reason, I'm not really going to talk about how you should use this against the enemy, but rather how you can use this in many ways to help you. More specifically, some tricks that you can use while using the Wrangler to better your defense against the enemy. So with that being said, let's talk about the stats. The Rescue Ranger has a unique alternative fire mode that allows you to pick up a building from a far distance at the cost of 100 metal. And of course, as long as you have a sufficient supply of metal, you can repair friendly buildings apart from your own. As for cons, you have a 34% clip size reduction as well as a 50% reduction on max primary ammo. You are also self-marked for dev when hauling buildings, and you have a 4:1 health to metal ratio when repairing buildings. So all of this is pretty straightforward, but I'll go more in depth when I actually show gameplay. In terms of damage, its maximum ramp up is 60, its base damage is 40, and its maximum fall off is 21. A crit with this will give you 120 damage, while a mini crit does between 54 and 81. As mentioned before, the Rescue Ranger is first and foremost a tool, and I'm sure everyone knows what it does. For every single piece of metal that you have, you're able to give 4 health points to any building, whether it's your own or another teammate's. And it doesn't matter how far you are because range only affects the damage and not the healing part. So what this means is that as long as your buildings are visible to yourself or perhaps another engineer, you shouldn't have any trouble healing them. But of course, that's only if you can aim properly, and with the Rescue Ranger it can get a bit tricky. Mostly because the bolts themselves are rather small, but regardless, they still travel to their assigned destination. But even if you find yourself missing every single shot, that doesn't mean your building has to be destroyed for that, because remember, you can also teleport your building at the cost of 100 metal. This to me is really what makes the Rescue Ranger shine, because you don't have to sacrifice your buildings to the enemy. All you really have to do is make sure that you're at a safe distance to pull your buildings back, as well as make sure that there are no enemies nearby. So with that said, I think now is a good time to move on to how I would use the Rescue Ranger along with the Wrangler, as I mentioned in the beginning of the video. I'm sure many experienced engineers are familiar with rocket jumping, however, in my experience, I haven't really utilized it all that much. It's not necessarily because I'm terrible at it, but rather because I'm not too familiar where the best locations are to set up a sentry or a teleporter. In this case, however, I decided to place my sentry on top of these pillars, and it actually worked out pretty well for the most part, and that's mostly because the enemies weren't really rushing this position all that much. But nevertheless, this is a good way to experiment with what works and what doesn't as an engineer, because most of the time the enemy will be able to shoot at your sentry or other buildings from a safe distance, but in this case the enemy pretty much has to show themselves in order to actually destroy your sentry. As you can see here, my sentry does take a bit of damage, but luckily it was not destroyed, so I was able to heal it with the Rescue Ranger. Now of course I could just sentry jump over there to heal it with my wrench, but it would be a bit inconvenient seeing how I could just heal it from a safe distance. And not just that, but your sentries are more likely to be destroyed than actually run out of ammo, unless if you're using the Wrangler. In this match, however, I didn't really use the Wrangler all that much in an offensive way because the enemy for the most part stayed back unless if there was some occasional scout or spy sneaking up behind us. So it really depends where you place your sentry and how much visibility it has, because even if your sentry is not able to take care of an enemy who's too far away, you might still be able to do it if you have the Wrangler in hand. But even if you don't, it's not necessarily a bad idea to move your sentry from one place to another if you have a chance, especially to create a choke point. Though of course you also want to make sure that your buildings are visible and accessible from a far distance if you want to heal them or move them somewhere else. And even if your sentry is destroyed, if you manage to build a new one fast enough, you might be able to use the Wrangler if you couldn't before. Though that might not save you from death, and unfortunately I got really unlucky when the spy killed me and destroyed all of my buildings. So it's probably a good idea to check your surroundings whenever possible. So that's pretty much all I have to say about the Rescue Ranger. I know this video was really short in comparison to my other analysis videos, but I didn't really know what else to say about it. If I was to talk about how I would use it as a weapon, it will kind of be useless because the damage is really low and it's kind of hard to aim with already. I'm sure most people have found a way to make it work, but I never really get that lucky when using it. But nevertheless, if you're not interested in doing a lot of damage yourself as an engineer, then this is a good compromise for it. It does take time to understand how to use it properly, especially if you want to pair it off with the Wrangler, but if you're willing to understand it, then I think it will prove itself to be very useful to you. Anyways, have a good day.